Hello everyone, Roby is here, and today I'm happy to present to you the 6th episode in the Assassin's Creed The Real History Revival series. The purpose of these videos is to walk through the representation of characters within the Assassin's Creed franchise and compare their depictions in the game to the historical source material that inspired this portrayal. Please be warned of impending spoilers for the remainder of the video. In this episode, I'll be covering one of the most interesting noblemen and military leaders to have lived throughout the Italian Renaissance, Cesare Borgia, a man who we all met during the events of Assassin's Creed Brotherhood. Before I start, please note that many portions of this individual's life are heavily debated, with the main argument being that his family was the subject of historical propaganda spread by their enemies. In this video, I'll be covering his agreed upon history while also sharing these points of contention and identifying them as they arise. Therefore, to begin the video, let's discuss Cesare's early years prior to his appearance in the game. Interestingly enough, his birth is said to have either been in September of 1475 or April of 1476. Cesare was the illegitimate son of the then Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia and his mistress Vanozza de Catani. Although he had multiple siblings through his father, Cesare's immediate siblings were Juan, or Giovanni Borgia as he was also known, Lucrezia Borgia, and Goffredo Borgia. Another debated point is the identity of the eldest child among the four, with the majority stating it was Cesare, but with a few other sources believing it may have actually been Giovanni. In 1480, using his connections to Pope Sixtus IV, Rodrigo succeeded in having his children's illegitimacy overlooked, thus allowing Cesare to follow in his footsteps by joining the church under the guise of being his nephew. It is important to understand that Rodrigo Borgia had large plans for his family's future, which involved putting his children in various positions of power. While his older half-brother Pedro Luis was expected to pursue a military career and was accordingly granted all of the Borgia titles and estates in Spain, Cesare, the supposed second eldest, was instead meant to attain a high-ranking position in the church. For that reason, Cesare received a strong education, leading him to eventually achieve a degree in law. Through his father's connections and acts of nepotism, he quickly rose in the church's hierarchy, becoming a bishop at age 15, an archbishop at 17, and eventually a cardinal at 18, following his father's ascension to the papacy in 1492, at which point Rodrigo became Pope Alexander VI. Following the death of Pedro Luis in either 1488 or 1491, a replacement was necessary to maintain the Borgia's familial titles and estates while also being their military representative. With Cesare already in a position of power within the church, his brother Giovanni was instead chosen to fill this role. Consequently, as their father was elected pontiff, Giovanni was made captain general of the papal armies, a role Cesare envied. In 1494, King Charles VIII, supported by Italian allies, led a French invasion of Italy and attempted to conquer Naples, but was eventually forced to flee in 1497 when faced by the Holy League, an alliance of opposing factions organized by the Borgia Pope. During this period, there are a few historical points of contention to address. Certain sources believe that around this time Cesare contracted syphilis, possibly from a prostitute. These accounts claim he sought exploratory treatments for his condition, but eventually resorted to wearing a partial mask to hide the affected portion of his face, although this concept is sometimes argued. Another vague point is Cesare's degree of involvement in the Pope's conflict with the preacher Girolamo Savonarola, who operated in Florence. The main argument lies in whether or not Cesare was instrumental in acquiring a forced confession of heresy from the friar to further justify his excommunication by the Pope. In June of 1497, Giovanni Borgia was murdered and his body dumped in the river. Although he had many enemies who could have orchestrated his murder, one theory proposed that Cesare killed his brother. The suspicion was never proven, but has been suggested because his death cleared the way for Cesare to become captain general, a position some felt his brother was wasting. Within the Assassin's Creed lore, Cesare organized his brother's assassination by having a courtesan allied with the Templars kill him. Around this time, Lucrezia Borgia was accused of having an incestuous relationship with her brother Cesare. Although it could be possible, with many records stating the siblings were very close, there has yet to be any solid proof that such an affair occurred. Many sources attribute this claim as being a piece of anti-Borgia propaganda spread by Lucrezia's spiteful first husband. Historically, although Cesare sought to become the Pope's military commander, his efforts were stymied by the King of Spain, who opposed the idea of a cardinal leaving his post for political reasons. However, following a truce between France and Spain concerning the shared ownership of Naples, the Pope negotiated with the new French king, Louis XII, to organize Cesare's release from his cardinal duties. This deal had the Pope annul the king's marriage for his support, making Cesare among the first individuals to resign his cardinalship on August 17, 1498. Immediately after, King Louis XII made him the Duke of Valentinois. By 1499, Cesare was married to Charlotte d'Albret, sister of Navarre's king, thus further solidifying a Borgia alliance with the French. Together they had a daughter, Cesare's only officially recognized child, despite having likely fathered over 11 illegitimate children. Later that year, when King Louis XII began his invasion of Italian states to which he held a paternal claim, he was joined by Cesare, who led some of his attacks. Capitalizing on the chaos introduced by the French invasion, Pope Alexander VI deposed all the independent representatives who ruled cities in Romagna and Marche. Some of these were thereafter invaded by Cesare, who established his own rule and was often preferred by the citizens. At this point, we can move on to chapter 2 of the video, in which we will discuss Cesare's appearance in the game. Assassin's Creed Brotherhood has his first appearance occurring during the fictional siege of Monteriggioni in January of 1500. This invented confrontation saw him kill Mario Auditore, have Ezio shot, steal the Apple of Eden, and kidnap Caterina Sforza. Although this was all fictionalized, keep in mind that last portion about Caterina, as it will be discussed further in a moment. Historically, for his successes, Cesare was rewarded with full command of the papal army, which he bolstered with French troops and Italian mercenaries. His first actions were to seize the cities of Imola and Forli, ousting their ruler Caterina Sforza, who was eventually captured and later imprisoned in the Castel Sant'Angelo. Pleased with this progress, the Pope made Cesare Gonfaloniere of the Church and funded an army of Italian mercenaries by creating 12 new cardinal positions in 1500. Before advancing, Cesare trusted his captured cities to a few lieutenants, among which was likely his most loyal soldier, a man generally referred to as Micheletto Corella, who would historically come to be known as Cesare's Butcher. Nevertheless, with this increased force, the Duke assigned multiple officers to put his commands into effect and manage his conquered lands. Despite never being fully proven, Cesare is believed to have played a role in murdering his sister's second husband, Alfonso of Aragon, in August of 1500. These accounts claim that he had Micheletto and some of his men kill Alfonso as a way of solidifying his alliance with France against Naples, thus severing his ties to Spain. Other propaganda-based sources said he did it simply out of romantic jealousy. Assassin's Creed further propagated this unconfirmed narrative by having Ezio spy on Cesare in 1501, first seeing him speak with his generals and later confirming his romantic interest in Lucrezia, who he used as a tool against his father. With a French-supported army, Cesare captured many regional cities until he was declared Duke of Romagna in May of 1501. After aiding the French in taking Naples, Cesare expanded his conquest to the neighboring regions until the end of 1502. It was throughout these final conquests that he was joined by Niccolò Machiavelli, a Florentine ambassador who studied the young commander and used him as an inspiration for some of the content found in his infamous treatise named The Prince. Whether his depiction of Cesare was positive or negative is still debated by historians to this day, with some reading honest admiration in the text, while others simply see satire. In this period, Cesare was betrayed by some of his officers who plotted to overthrow him in what became known as the Magione conspiracy. He successfully managed the political front and kept a strong influence, eventually destabilizing this alliance of enemies. He then offered the plotters a chance at reconciliation. However, when they met Cesare, he had them imprisoned and then strangled, with some records stating Micheletto assisted him in this task. Although not directly represented in the game, these events were alluded to in the Assassin's Creed lore. It's worth mentioning that during this period, Cesare Borgia did employ Leonardo da Vinci as his chief military architect and engineer for his campaigns. However, it's important to note that although da Vinci never created plans for a variety of war machines, as was seen in Brotherhood, he did in fact produce strategic maps and designs which were used to improve the Borgia fortifications in captured cities. In addition, claims have been made that da Vinci used Cesare, considered among the most handsome men of his period, as an inspiration when painting Jesus in some portraits. However, this was never confirmed and remains an extremely debated topic. In 1503, an incident occurred involving Francesco Trocche, one of the Pope's chamberlains. Despite the details being ambiguous, certain sources state that he either recently betrayed or failed the Borgias in a significant way and was suddenly found dead soon after. Conflicting reports say he either committed suicide by drowning or was strangled and dumped in the river. In Assassin's Creed Brotherhood's interpretation of the history, the latter proved to be the case when Cesare had Micheletto kill the man as they saw him as a liability. In the following in-game segments in 1503, Cesare can be seen attending a pagan orgy party of sorts and making a speech about unifying Italy. Although certain texts state that he did take part in such events, other sources believe this to be defamatory propaganda. Historically, the following months of 1503 proved to be incredibly difficult for Cesare, as his French allies were defeated in Naples by the Spanish. This was worsened in Brotherhood as the assassins weakened his forces in Rome. The game then has Cesare confronting the Pope about his limited funds, leading the men to argue about his behavior and desire for power. Lucrezia suddenly arrives, revealing that Cesare has been poisoned by the Pope, to which he responds by choking the pontiff with his own tainted apple.
I control all of this. If I want to live, I live. If I want to take, I take. If I want you to die, you die!
In reality, a few days after dining with his father on August 6th, both men became seriously ill. Cesare barely succeeded in overcoming the violent illness, but the pontiff was not as lucky and died from it on the 18th. Assassin's Creed justified Cesare's sickness as being caused by the lesser dose of poison he ingested. Historically, as he recovered from his sickness, Cesare got a short reprieve when Pope Pius III, a man who'd supported the Borgia's efforts in the past, was elected as pontiff. Unfortunately, Pius's sudden death just 26 days later left the papacy open once again. In desperation, Cesare was tricked with promises of financial and military support by Cardinal della Rovere, a man who had strongly opposed the Borgias in the past, into supporting his bid to become pope. This manipulation proved successful, and della Rovere became Pope Julius II, subsequently reneging on his promises, demanding ownership of Romagna, and ordering the arrest of Cesare. The game showed this sequence slightly differently, with Cesare first losing the Peace of Eden to Ezio, then attempting to gather his remaining forces, and ultimately failing when the Papal Guard, sent by Julius II, arrived to arrest him. Historical records indicate that the Borgia noble was successful in delaying his arrest by surrendering multiple cities to the new pontiff. However, upon his arrival in Naples in mid-1504, he was arrested by the Spanish viceroy and his remaining holdings were confiscated by the Pope. By August, Cesare had been imprisoned in Spain and was moved to a more fortified position after a failed escape attempt. With external assistance, Cesare eventually succeeded in escaping his Spanish prison in 1506, and ultimately reached his brother-in-law, King John III of Navarre, in December of the same year. Upon arriving, he joined the king's efforts to consolidate his control in Navarre. This sequence was briefly reflected in Assassin's Creed Brotherhood, with Ezio using the Apple of Eden to discover that Cesare had in fact escaped and acquire his location. Historically, Cesare led the king's forces and succeeded in capturing the city of Viana. However, he was incapable of taking its castle. His troops then laid siege to the fortress. In the game, the assassin met him on the battlefield. They fought and later reached the castle, where Ezio was victorious and dropped Cesare off the wall. In reality, although the 1507 date is debated as either being March 11th or 12th, in the midst of a storm, the knights within the castle attempted an escape. Their timing allowed them to successfully bypass their attackers, but it is said Cesare chased them and was eventually ambushed, outnumbered, and killed by the knights. Many records state he was stripped of all of his possessions, including his clothing and weapons, and was left nearly naked on the ground to later be found by his soldiers. Having reached the conclusion of Cesare's life, let's proceed to the final chapter of the video, where we'll review everything we've learned so far and compare his depiction in the game to his documented history. As always, I'd like to start with a quick list, jotting down the definitively fictional portions of his portrayal. First, and I know this is ridiculously obvious, but I'll say it anyways, Cesare Borgia was not a member of the Templar Order and did not seek a piece of Eden. Next, there was no siege of Montedigione perpetrated by the Borgia, and the capturing of Caterina Sforza, which happened therein, actually occurred while she was defending her city of Forli. It can also be said that although Da Vinci was employed by Cesare for a time, he never designed and built him war machines. Lastly, Cesare's arrest did not occur after fighting the assassins in Rome, nor did his death come at the hands of Ezio Auditore while on the castle walls of Viana. With these clear ideas in mind, I'd like to now mention the major points of contention, where the game took a stand on a debated topic that some sources would agree with, but others would vehemently deny. These would include his involvement in his brother's death, his incestuous relationship with Lucrezia, his involvement in Francesco Trocche's death, his participation in pagan parties, and his potential role in the Pope's death. As I mentioned earlier, the game's interpretation of these cases represents some of the popular opinions, but are fundamentally based on unconfirmed data that many claim to have originated from anti-Borgia propaganda created by their adversaries both during and after their rise to power. When discussing the elements the game got right, I'll be sticking to the confirmed historical instances. To begin, I like the way his relationship with the French military was nicely depicted in the game, with them supporting his campaigns in Italy. The subsequent mentions of how he quelled the rebellion within his ranks was also a proper nod to the history. Then, although his exact involvement was altered, I did like how Da Vinci was depicted as being under Cesare's employment at the proper historical interval. In addition, his constant use of Micheletto as a trusted officer was well depicted. Lastly, despite the circumstances varying from history, his sickness around the time of his arrest and the period in which he died were properly demonstrated. Now that we are armed with all this information, let's face the difficult question of whether Cesare Borgia was fairly represented in Assassin's Creed Brotherhood. To put it simply, it really depends on your historical perspective. Like I said at the beginning of the video, the Borgia family evokes very polarizing interpretations, with some claiming that they were the worst, most corrupt, infamous, and dangerous family of the period, while others state they really weren't all that different from their contemporaries, and have just been further demonized by those they had wronged during their rise to power in an ultimate example of the quote, "History is written by the victors." If we are talking about the purely factual, predominantly undeniable facts about the Borgia, it could be said that Cesare's depiction in the game was unfair and biased, making him into the stereotypical villain. However, since so much of his history is drenched in controversy and debate, it is fair to say that his representation in the game was more indicative of the popular perception of the Borgia family, as opposed to the completely fact-based interpretation. All the same, it's important to note that had the game stuck solely to the unarguable facts, there wouldn't be a whole lot to cover about Cesare in this story. As the usual methodology of the Assassin's Creed writers is to use historical omissions to add in the game's fictional narrative, in this case it was just brought a bit further by tying it into much of the unconfirmed speculation about the individual's history. Although I may not completely agree with the game's large reliance on speculated portions of Cesare's life, I understand its importance for pushing the narrative of the Borgia as the villains in Brotherhood. However, for me personally, my biggest qualm with the story was when Cesare killed the Pope. Despite this having been proposed by some sources, it seems incredibly unlikely, as it meant a probable loss of papal favor, which was eventually the case. However, I suppose the game could counter this by stating he wouldn't need it if he had the Apple of Eden. Nevertheless, at its core, Assassin's Creed Brotherhood's story still shows us the rise of the Borgia family, with its coordination of Pope Alexander VI as the politician who had his military efforts supported by his ambitious and ruthless son Cesare, leading to the growth and then sudden fall of their power base in Rome. It is filled with historical references of nepotism, clever political maneuvers, and displays of how Cesare succeeded in establishing his own Italian state in just 3 years. As a quick final note, in spite of the game excluding any mentions of his possible dealings with syphilis and the idea that he wore a mask to hide it, I'd like to think that his erratic behavior in his final years, perhaps best demonstrated in his last battle with Ezio where he stated, "No man can murder me," were potential nods to his mental deterioration caused by the disease, which some historians have pointed as a possibility. And with that, we finished what I imagine to be another heavy episode of Assassin's Creed: The Real History. If you enjoyed the video, please help spread the word about this series and share it with your friends. Should you have any requests for a future video topic, please leave it in the comments. My sources for making this video can be found in the description bar below. Thanks for watching.